I'm Dr. Urmila Thatte, and I am a professor of clinical pharmacology, and therefore perhaps in my presentations you will find a little more drug-related discussions. But I also am working on these ethics committee for a long time now, and I've been associated with this NIH course because I've sort of helped Nandini with the research ethics component, and I think I stand here today. I must say a special thanks to the ICMR. More than a thanks, I should say a congratulations, because I think this is a phenomenal activity and job, and we've been going around the country. I don't know how many workshops Nandini has organized, and I think the perseverance that she's shown and the enthusiasm that she's shown, I hope that our bioethics, human resource development is able to fulfill the needs that our country is seeing. Now, what I had, when we planned this program, what I had envisaged was that you would have these codes with you, and we would be, so you would read them, and then we would discuss each code, because we assume that when you go back, you would yourself be doing some ethics review related activities, either as ethics committee members, or you may have to review proposals from an ethics point of view as scientists, or whatever the case may be. I believe that unless we have read and studied these codes and guidelines ourselves, literally word to word and line to line, and internalized the concepts behind these codes, I believe that we are not in a position to be able to deliver opinions on any of these ethical reviews. This is a personal opinion that I have, and I hope at the end of this you will share that opinion with me. So what I have done, instead of giving homework, and I thought we wouldn't have adequate time really for you to go through each individual thing, I have put down here on my slides the major salient features of these, of 5 of the different guidelines which I think are most relevant for us when we're working in this country. I do hope you will interrupt me, because it's not going to be a didactic question and lecture. I want us to discuss this. I'm not going to be telling you anything new, because this is there, you must have read this. But I want you to think up of issues that come up and how we can use these guidelines to answer those issues. That is what my objective at the end of this session is, for you to be able to appreciate the main thrust of most of these guidelines, so that we are able to apply them when we are actually doing research. And my second objective is to make you feel a little like this cartoon, because that's what happens when we sit and actually read these guidelines. These are the 5 codes or guidelines that I'm going to talk about. A little repetitive perhaps, because I heard Nandini and Lata talk a little bit about some of them. Perhaps the original of all guidelines that we have is the Nuremberg Code, and it's really the first time that it's clearly mentioned that there should be consent. But it's not just that a mention of voluntary consent. It also says all research should be, this consent should be given by a person where there is legal validity to it. So there has to be a law also in place in the country, so that you know at what age. So if a child at 17 is giving consent, it's not legally valid, even if that child can understand everything. So it has to be a legally valid consent. And we're talking as far back as 60 years ago that this statement was made. Freely given, no form of coercion. Some of these things are understood. But what do you mean by coercion? How do you interpret? Is there any coercion happening? For example, if I, as a clinical pharmacologist, am doing a study in my students, many guidelines say that you can't do research on students and things. How should I justify that I'm not using coercion, that this would be a genuinely freely given consent, is something that you need to think of. And that's where I think these guidelines only give us a direction. They don't lead you. You have to then decide, okay, give each project its own credit. Ask the investigator to justify. And only if those justifications you feel are within this framework, then we should give permissions or whatever the case may be. You know, if you read today's ICMR guidelines or you read Schedule Y, there are 101 elements of an informed consent form, and most pharma companies, when we are reviewing ethics, informed consents, go so much by paper, by what is written over there, that every little word is put there. I don't really know if the patient understands what's written over there. But as far back as Nuremberg, they've actually mentioned that your informed consent should describe this, the experiment itself. The patient should understand this, that is. How is this experiment to be conducted? Your methodology has to be there. What is the inconveniences and hazards that the patient is expected? You know, many studies I have seen, I've reviewed consent forms, and you must have reviewed too, where the investigator says, only blood collection is done, so there is no risk, there is no inconvenience, there is no harm. It's a perfectly safe study. But I can understand that, I mean, you all know, that taking blood means there is pain, there is a possibility of a hematoma, there is a possibility that you may end up in causing infection, and there may be so many other potential side effects that you better explain, because the person undergoing the procedure is not a doctor, is not a paramedical person, is a person who doesn't understand these things. So all the inconveniences, including having to wait perhaps, or including having to come to the hospital, according to me, for a patient to come to the hospital every day is as well an inconvenience, because you're intruding on his day-to-day life, which has to be explained to him, and the effects upon his health which may come from participation. So what we mean is the adverse reactions. What I appreciated about Nuremberg Code is that the responsibility of this consent process, including what is going into this process of rewriting that informed consent form, is the personal duty of the investigator and should not be delegated to somebody else with impunity. So if I, as a principal investigator, am going to ask my PG student to do this work, it still is my responsibility that it's done well. Have I trained this person to conduct this consent process? Have I actually read the consent form? Sometimes these pharma companies come up with these consent forms, and I think as an investigator, all of us have to read this and understand it as well. I think Nuremberg Code very clearly tells us who is responsible in this case. Obviously, there are other general statements in the Nuremberg Code, that research should yield fruitful results for the good of society. I think somebody asked a question some time ago, what is society? That individual, that community that person lives in, or humanity? It's a difficult question to answer, and actually all these questions can be answered perhaps only by that ethics committee, which is there to protect the patient who is participating in this study. If the patient appears to be being exploited because somebody living in America is going to benefit from it, then obviously even this question of equitable selection of participants is not fulfilled. We'll come to that in Belmont, where it is more detailed explained. Nuremberg also tells us that perhaps it was very relevant in those days. You know, it came from these experimentations by Nazis, that whatever we're planning to do in the human subject should not be possible by other methods. The research should be necessary. Again, as an ethics committee member, you must have come across lots of research proposals which are, you know, for drugs which are already there in the market, and then these companies want to promote that XY St. John's Medical College has done this, you know, reputed AIMS has done this wonderful thing. They want to put it on their promotional activity. So they do these clinical trials, but they're not answering any question. There's no question to answer. They're often open label studies, no comparisons are being done. Ask yourself this question, is this research at all necessary? Is there a clinical or research question there? And that's why everybody who's sitting on an ethics committee needs to read these, because see, it's very clearly said here. Obviously, do not cause disability or death except, I don't know why they said this. I found it interesting, so I put it here. Except where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. I don't know what the House feels about this.
No, experimental physician might be motivated or one-off person. And so he might want to die, but I don't think.
Exactly, but this is what the Nuremberg Code says. So obviously we have to understand that codes are not be all and end alls of everything. But I put it down over here for all of us to think that this is what evolved immediately after the Nazi war crimes. So at that time it was felt that, okay, you want to do horrible experiments, then you be a subject yourself and then do them if you want to. Otherwise, don't do them on patients. And as you say, in today's age, it's not acceptable. In fact, self-experimentation is looked down upon and is in fact considered fairly unethical now. Because there are a lot of issues about voluntariness, about conflict of interest, and risk-benefit analysis. All of those come into the picture. So I think this is a point in the Nuremberg Code which perhaps is not applicable in 2007, but it's there in the original code that we have. See this. As far back as in 1947, they've said this. And it's so applicable. If anybody were to ask you, why are you looking at my scientific design? You only look at ethics. How many of you all have been accused of this in ethics committees? I'm sure all of your hands will raise. If you are serving on an ethics committee, most investigators are most angry. Somebody asked this question also, science review and ethics review. Even if there are scientific and ICMR guidelines today are telling us do both review process, I think it's clearly mentioned in these codes that it's our responsibility as ethicists to even review the science, because the design should give results that justify the performance of an experiment. If it's a poor design, you know, there are so many studies designed where I'm going to do the study in 15 patients and it's going to be an open label study. And at the end of the study, you will just say that further studies are required.
Dr. Urmila,
yes.
I just had one clarification. See, I'm also a part of some of the ethics committees, but most often the other members do not agree to discuss about the methodological part of it. Like, you know, the scientific issues as you mentioned. So how do we go about it? They are quite reluctant. They say, let us go on to the ethical aspects. Why do you want to look at the methods? So how do we convince them?
I would like to ask a counter question. Does this ethics committee have a pre-scientific review?
No, they don't have.
In which case,
but they are still reluctant to sort of, you know, look into the methodological things. So
but you educate the ethics committee then. if there is a scientific committee before, scientific review before the ethics review,
right.
Often it is suggested to the ethics committee members and it's put in their SOPs that don't look again at scientific, don't do nitpicking. Small things like maybe you should do this, do that, because the scientific committee is expected to have done that.
But the major things which require some attention.
Read the Nuremberg Code, read any other code. Everybody tells you that the methodology that you're using should justify the you should get results. It should not be a design that you won't get results. As I said, somebody wants to do a study in 10 patients. This often happens with postgraduate thesis, in fact. Extremely, because you have to do it in 1 year or something like that. So people want to compromise. So you must educate your ethics committee.
With respect to ICMR institutes, we have scientific advisory committee meeting before our ethics committee meeting. So the technical and scientific part of the study is taken care of. So when such time when a question is there that to deal with the methodology or the design of the study, we say it's taken care of. So to focus more on the ethical
aspects, correct. However, I would like to reiterate that if there is something grossly missing in the scientific design, it still falls within the rights of the ethics committee members to raise them. And this is an ethical code which is telling us to do it. So it is good science is good ethics. So it is ethical to look at the science part. Yes, Dr. Nandini.
This portion about the scientific review and ethics review is very often debated by the investigators themselves. That once it has been reviewed scientifically, who are you to judge the science of this proposal? But what happens is, apart from what Urmila has already explained, sometimes, in smaller institutions, you may have this scientific committee made up of your own friends. So they will pass it. But the ethics committee is supposed to be independent in nature. And you have scientists in that also. So these scientists will easily pick up those loopholes and they will say, how was this passed by the scientific committee? And that's where the conflict comes. So this is always debated. And in ICMR itself, one person who had training in ethics committee management, just fresh from there for 6 months, she was made to present what she learned and she was explaining everything and all that. At the end of it, 2 of the senior scientists of ICMR, when my chief is there, those who know her will know that if she is there, nobody speaks because she is the authority. But she was not there. And despite my presence being there, despite people knowing that I am qualified, and despite knowing that this girl has undergone this long training, these 2 guys were simply shouting and saying, the ethics committee has no right to judge the science when it has been passed by the scientific committee of ICMR. And then one of these guys now comes along with us in the ethics committee ethics workshops, and he's more learned now. And the other person is, of course, out of picture now, right now.
So I think what we learn at the end of this whole thing is that educating ethics committees is as important, members is, and oh yes, I'm coming to that, but and I meant not once, but a continual process of education. I'll come to it in the ICMR guidelines. And the second point is this, that an ethics committee is within its right to take decisions and make opinions. But if you have a committee where the chairperson is strong and willing to allow debate and willing to allow you to express something, that's important. And that's why when you look at qualities of people who participate in an ethics committee, this is, the chairperson is very important. The chairperson may tell you, no, we're not going to look at this. And what is in your SOPs is also equally important. I think all of these things will keep coming up as we go along the different guidelines and codes. I suggest to all of you that each ethics committee, wherever they are, must have these codes as printed physical hard copies, because those are the things that you work on. It should not be just, I feel that this is how it is. It should not be. It's based on guidelines. It's based on codes, your decisions or your opinions. And those are more acceptable, even to investigators, because educating investigators is an equally important task of an ethics committee.
But what happens is, most of the time, scientifically or by design, it is okay. But the results which are going to come up out of it might lack statistical power, so that nobody can adopt or practice that way.
Yeah.
Many of the theses, PG theses, would be like this. In such a condition, what shall we do?
Very good point you've raised. We face this often in our ethics committees. What we do is we talk to the guide. You see, the student has a time limit. He has to finish a thesis or a it's not a thesis, it's a dissertation most of the time. And they're expected to finish it in the course of their training, where they learn research methodologies in perhaps a year. Either you give as a guide a topic which can be covered in that much time, which is scientifically acceptable, or it should be an ongoing process where one year's thesis doesn't give you conclusions, but an epidemiological study spread over 3 years. So 3 consecutive students do the topic, but they are giving continuing results and they refer to the previous students' work as well. It should not be a cut-paste copy that many students do. That is plagiarism, and I think you're going to be discussing that as well. But you have to have this broad framework as well. But it's something that needs to be looked at. Nuremberg Code tells us one more interesting thing, which I think may not be acceptable, because that's why I put this exclamation mark here. It says based on results of animal experimentation. Always we cannot do an animal experimentation, but this may be applicable to drugs at least. There should be some previous experimentation. The animal activists may not appreciate this particular guideline mentioned in this code. I've just put it there. You see, this is something else that ethics or bioethics teaches us, and that is that it's so dynamic. What was perhaps almost law in 1947 has different connotations today, and we have to look at it from that point of view. It says do adequate literature search. Termination of study is also mentioned, and very clearly the participant I think the word participant was, is being used now rather than subject, because subject becomes a very, a slightly derogatory term, as well as it becomes a very, not a, what do you say, we are both participants. You're participating in a collaborative effort. You're not a topic of experimentation. When you say subject, you become a topic of experimentation. When you're a participant, you're involved in the process in a way that also emphasizes that the volunteer or the subject is actually participating. He has to contribute, he has to follow that protocol, and therefore his cooperation is equally important. It's a little deeper as well. Of course, investigator also can terminate. See 10 points and look at the number of issues that it discusses. Clearly, in simple words, risk-benefit analysis must be favorable. Not going on to describe in detail, that comes in Belmont, where they discuss risk-benefit analysis in more detail. This is so important and so crucial. And if you read literature on risk-benefit analysis, you find ethics committees don't know how to do this. In fact, it's very difficult to quantify risks and to quantify benefits and then to do an actual quantification, to put mathematics or statistics to this. And it's really relevant, I think, because we all need to start thinking as we evolve on how we can actually do a good risk-benefit analysis. Adequate facilities for care. Suppose an adverse event occurs while you're doing this research. Suppose something goes wrong with the patient. Who will look after the patient? What is the understanding? All procedures. Nandini told us about the Ayurvedic collaborators. Why? Because as per the current law, allopathic doctors should not be prescribing medicines in which they are not registered or taught.
Who are not trained to practice.
Trained. Therefore, who will take responsibility? Do you have facilities? If an Ayurvedic man is doing research, then do they have the facilities? This is also equally important. Who should conduct the research was another topic that we were discussing. Scientifically qualified persons with the highest degree of skill and care. This gets more and more detailed as we go along. I won't spend too much time on it. Which finishes Nuremberg Code. Do we have any other specific points to discuss on this Nuremberg Code? 10 points highlighting voluntary consent. Read it. It's in your folders, I believe. It's very small, but I genuinely recommend you read it, internalize these guidelines. I find it easier to make opinions or to give decisions if they're based on these, because then they're easier to convey to people as well, because then they have to accept it, okay? This is based on ICMR guidelines. It is the personal duty and responsibility to decide on the quality of the consent. Now here they don't mean that the written consent form. The consent means the whole consent process, which includes the form as well as the actual taking of the consent process, etc. You can't describe it in one point. So the investigator's responsibility. In drug studies, consent forms are made by companies and given to the investigators.
This happens mostly with the PGs, postgraduate students. No doubt the drug has been proved to be effective and is in use. But many of the professors in making their students do studies on the same drug. Mm-hmm. Their clarification or their defense is that it has not been done in this population. It has been in some other population.
Well, it's true in a way, and therefore ethnic differences, if you want to find, this is something which the local ethics committee is the only people, the experts, the scientific experts in the local ethics committee will be able to answer this. And therefore, when you're reviewing studies, you need to, as ethics committees, also have access to literature yourself. So if it's not been done in populations you're from Imphal? Yeah. So in Imphal, if it's not been done, well, why not? See, we don't know these. We don't know answers to this, whether they are ethnically different and whether they respond differently, whether they require different rules. You don't have to only do cutting edge research with new molecules. That's not possible for everybody. And clinicians have to do research on such things which are relevant to their practice. If there is a question, it needs to be answered. However, whatever level of greatness in that science, one person may be doing research on a totally new molecule. The other person may be doing research which is applicable to him and his patients. That's also research.
Wider implication in the sense that drug trials cannot be done all over the world in that sense. So if every country, or for that matter, every locality, if they say that we would like to do on that ground, that could be another problem.
In what way would it be an ethical problem? I'll tell you one thing. According to me, if you look at the ethnic variability we have in the world, every time a doctor gives a drug to a patient, it's an experiment. Because that patient may react differently. That's the whole basis of idiosyncrasy and adverse reactions like that. Efficacy may vary. We all know we are all relying on a lot of Western literature to decide our doses, while in practice, doctors are actually using lower doses without research, without evidence. So generate the evidence, we are happier, no? Should promote local research, local knowledge. Antibiotic resistance. What's the use of taking Sweden's antibiotic resistance patterns, because it doesn't match ours? We've done a community study in antibiotic resistance. In the community, there's a 65% resistance to ciprofloxacin. In the community, we're not talking about hospitals. And the same percent in Sweden is 3%. So what's the use of using Western literature to do practice here? So yes, you must promote. If you have an ethical issue on this, do raise it, because I don't think you're convinced. That's the whole issue. No, and I don't, perhaps I should go forward because we don't have time now to discuss it, but this is, again, it is illustrative of how ethics committees function. And according to me, it's so important that every member of the committee participates, and hopefully, of course, you can do it by votes, but preferably on really important issues, there should be a consensus. If there is a voting also, whatever is as per your SOPs, so that, because it's possible that it's always gray. You think it's right and I think it's wrong, and how do we come and meet halfway? And ultimately, we have to think of the patient who's participating. That's the bottom line. Is he going to be exploited? Is he going to be protected? Are you generating genuine knowledge? All these questions are what we'll answer. Let's go ahead and go to Helsinki now. Do you know when Helsinki was first declared? The first declaration made? 1964, yes. The Declaration of Helsinki, it was adopted. What is this World Medical Association? Who consists of this World Medical Association, which is the one that actually did this or accepted this Declaration of Helsinki at Helsinki? WHO, UNESCO, US FDA, Switzerland. It's the World Medical Association. It's an association made of medical associations of every country. The Indian Medical Association is one of the representatives there. Go on the WMA website, read the history. Do it. It helps you to know who's made it. So we've made this. We, the medical associations, and therefore we have a right to change it. Whenever they have modifications, they post them and they tell you. It's not some august body sitting there. That's what, when Dr. Nandini said, I second it again, that these ICMR guidelines are reflecting their discussions over the last 6 years with so many of the people on the ground working, using these guidelines. And that feedback reflects in reality in these guidelines, because then they further help you to implement. So remember, we all have contributed to this declaration. And look at this, the history is quite long. Over the years, a number of modifications, and the one that we're using today is the one that was amended in Edinburgh in 2000. But, and we don't know why these notes of clarification have been made. They're important notes of clarification in Washington and Tokyo. I think one is of placebo and one is on post-trial access. I'll come to it as we go along. But what this whole declaration does consist of, and I generally, when I'm taking a research methodology lecture for my PG students as well, I insist that if you're going to do research, you have to read it. It's not so big, just 2 pages, 32 principles, 9 premises, 18 basic principles, and 5 additional principles. Let's just quickly run through them, they're useful. The first few premises, you know, it lays down, these are the assumptions. We assume that the patient is at the center of everything. And we are doing this based on the Declaration of Geneva and the International Code of Medical Ethics. So the patient and him as a patient is at the center of the whole thing, even though he is a participant in the research. So nobody who is going to do the research has to forget that. That is your first understanding. And therefore patient care is paramount. But on the other hand, they also say the second assumption, that medical progress is based on research. And therefore we all recognize that there is need for research. And therefore human experimentation is needed. We understand that the patient is important, but if we don't know if we have to progress, we have to do human experimentation. So this is the second premise. And the third premise they say is that the well-being of that particular patient takes precedence over the interests of society and science. I like this statement, and I think it is used quite often, and I think it helps national bodies as well. No national ethical, legal, or regulatory requirement should be allowed to reduce or eliminate any of the protections set forth in this declaration. This is a statement they make. And Declaration of Helsinki, I think as ethics committee members, you know, it comes to us with each protocol. We are following ethical principles is added, and as per Declaration of Helsinki, probably nobody has read it. I mean, amongst the investigators, but this is what is always attached, and this is the point. And it's very difficult anyway to go against Helsinki, you know, but this is a very clear statement that they have made. The 18 principles they have written, I'm not going to go into the detail of everything, just specify. I think here, for the first time, you've been clearly told you have to have a proper protocol. You can't just wake up in the morning and say, okay, I'm going to do research. You have to write down what you want to do and then do what you have written down, which is what the protocol actually is. But the second thing they have said, and this is the first time it comes if you look historically in the codes, that a specially appointed ethical review committee, which is independent of investigator and everybody else, without any undue influence, it should be considered, and where appropriate, approval should be taken of this ethics committee. Even the ICMR has told us which type of studies are exempt from ethics review. They've told us a couple of examples, and I would again recommend to you to read these. It's very useful when students will come to you and ask you, does this project require, can I not go to ethics committee? You don't need to answer it based on your personal opinion. It should be based on guidelines. And these guidelines, we now have national guidelines to follow, so do follow them. It tells us what to submit. Now this is a Ghisapita topic. Everybody tells you different things. Somebody adds 1 or 2 topics. Your question, the responsibility for the subject must rest with the medically qualified person and never, medically qualified person they say. Now a physiotherapy qualified person is also important, but the responsibility has to lie, but never rest on the subject, even though the subject has given consent. I personally feel that when we are working on ethics committees, we should, and we are professional bioethicists, we should rely a lot on what these guidelines tell us. If we therefore internalize them and therefore read them and read them and read them and read them again, then we tend to understand these principles and use them. So even if the subject is giving consent, the responsibility is with the investigator or the doctor. So I think what this teaches me is that informed consent may be legal, but it's not a protection for the doctor, for the investigator. It should be a mode of protecting the patient, the participant. Quite often you will have investigators who say, he signed informed consent, he knows everything, he's understood everything, I'm not responsible now. He shouldn't have consented. Who told him to consent? Good point. But the responsibility is yours. He shouldn't have consented. He consented, but he may not have understood what you told him. I've underlined this as far back as, I don't know when this came in, I couldn't find out when these modifications came in, but the current one of 2000 says that the design of all studies should be publicly available. That means Helsinki tells us, and if we want to follow Helsinki, all our clinical trials should be on a registry. And I think we have a clinical trial registry, at least this year we have. So we can all start applying to that registry so that we have methodology available. Go on again on the website, and ICMR has played a very important role in generating this clinical trials registry. It's something really useful, and I think it's based on the WHO model, but I'm not sure anybody is going to be putting their trials on. In our country, nobody does it unless it's compulsory, but we have to perhaps think of trying to make it compulsory somewhere, because the design of the studies, it's unethical if you don't have transparency. I think if we want to fulfill Helsinki, we all have to again internalize and insist upon these things. Somebody else had something to say.
Even now, some of the journals have made it compulsory to give the registration number in the abstract.
Yes.
In the
fact, they
section
don't.
of the abstract.
In fact, I think Lancet makes you submit the protocol before you do the study, and then they will approve that protocol also in terms of scientific appropriateness, and then you can go ahead and conduct the scientific study. Yes, Nandini.
Actually, we are digressing as it happened in mine also, but I just wanted to make it sure that whatever is registered in clinicaltrial.gov methodology is there. But seeing that, you know that the quality is not uniform. That itself, some of the trial, whatever has been placed there itself shows that this could be a doubtful trial. So that to some extent will get rectified in the trial registry that we have launched now.
Are we supposed to give all the details of the
They
clinical
have,
trial?
they have
the
some-
entire protocol,
They
is
have
it?
no. They have
Okay,
their points.
because I wasn't aware of it. Thanks a lot.
You can
yeah.
read go on the website. You'll get all the answers. Elements of consent are also written in Helsinki Declaration. You know, you will see historically, as we have evolved as a human race and as human rights have increased and the awareness of participants has increased, what goes into the consent has also increased. And unfortunately, therefore, today, our consent forms are sometimes 20 pages long. And genuinely, patients have to take them home to read if they're expected to understand what's in it. And if they read and understand that consent form, then that's what really we want them to do. So aims and, okay, the Helsinki tells us to talk about sources of funding in the consent form, possible conflicts of interests, institutional affiliations. You know, sometimes we find consent forms saying this is a drug trial approved by ICMR. In a way, when you say ICMR has approved it, the patient is automatically feeling comforted that, okay, somebody has approved it like ICMR or, you know, something like that. So as an ethics committee member, you need to look at these aspects of what is said in the consent form, and is it likely to induce the participation of the patient in any way. Or sometimes they'll say it is US FDA approved. If it's US FDA, it's even more feeling of comfort for the patient perhaps. The Helsinki Declaration also talks about verbal consent, and there are situations where you may waive the need for written consent, and if I mistake not, ICMR also talks about it. We'll come to it as we go along. The Declaration of Helsinki is clear about the ethics of publication. Negative and positive results should be publicly available, and if you have a registry, I think we could fulfill some of these. This is an important point, and these are the additional principles that have been laid down apart from the first basic ones. When medical research is combined with medical care, additional standards apply to protect patients who are research participants. I am a pharmacologist, so I'm not really a primary physician for the patient. Suppose my colleague in general medicine or neurology is the principal investigator. They are actually treating the patient and then going to start research on that patient. I believe you must be familiar with this concept of therapeutic misconception, which comes out of this in a way, that the patient believes that doing the research is important to get well and is unable to delineate this difference, that this is an investigator who has a totally different objective. While as my physician, she or he has only my interest at heart and is giving me treatments which are only good for me, which are known, which are evidence based. But now this same chap is doing research and he doesn't know whether this is working or not. In fact, he may be giving me a placebo. In fact, he may be giving me a medicine which is half as effective. How much more responsibility is of the doctor, who is also the investigator, to explain to the patient this so that he can take an informed decision. And that is what this method, this principle says. Investigators themselves have to realize the added responsibility they have. Because as a doctor, as a physician, you have a responsibility, but there is a hierarchical relationship in a physician-patient relationship in a way that the physician is often giving to the patient the treatments and making him better. When you are doing research, that is reversed according to me, the role. The patient is giving the information to the investigator as a physician. And this chap now, this doctor, has this dual role of being the taker and the giver. And how does he solve his own conflict of interest is, I think, very high level of ethics, and instinctively somebody may be able to do this if you're a good doctor and you realize. But I think it's important for that the investigator to understand the responsibility, added responsibility he has when he is planning research on patients he's going to treat. A new method should be tested against those of best current methods. This is the point that has been clarified subsequently. Placebo or no treatment should be allowed, and Declaration of Helsinki says this, when no proven method exists. For example, if you're going to do a study on rabies, treatment of rabies, there's no current treatment available, then you go ahead and do the first anti-HIV treatment, AZT, when it was tested, it was against placebo. We'll come to that also. But it is necessary for compelling scientific sound methodological reasons. But, and this last point is very important, and this places the whole responsibility on that ethics committee, that patients who take this placebo should not be at additional risk of serious or irreversible harms. So what checkpoints have been put in your protocol, that if a patient who is on a placebo, who has, usually there are about 40% to 60% placebo responses, remembered, with many of these psychiatric conditions or... Oh yeah, even for psychosis there is a huge placebo response. That's the whole reason, even for depression, even endogenous depression. All of them have got, in fact, even for somatic disorders like ulcerative colitis, you'll have a placebo response. So that placebo response is something that you have to go into literature, and you'll have, according to me, I don't want to discuss it here because like Nandini said, it's a topic in itself. You can have a whole day to discuss placebos. And again, believe me, there's nothing right and wrong. It has to be based on that protocol. And remember this, is it scientifically and methodologically necessary to have a placebo? And two, if you have a placebo, will that patient suffer? And for how long will he suffer? And you have it within your rights as a local ethics committee member, knowing your patients, to say no to a protocol. Yes.
Thank you. See, you said when no proven method.
Yeah.
Can you get back to the previous slide? Thank you.
I didn't say, this is what Helsinki says.
Right, ma'am. When no proven method exists,
Yes.
and use necessary for compelling and scientifically sound methodological. If it were an and, there is no problem. The ground is clear. But I mean, this exemption came sometime in 2000, Declaration of Helsinki, 2000, 2002, sometime like
one,
that.
yeah.
From then on, it has been a problem. It runs into all kinds of rough weather. FDA insists that, look here, you will have to have a placebo control regulatory thing. While all of us feel that when there is a standard of care, you compare that, you have it as a control arm. Recently, we had terrible time with one of the psychiatrists who kept saying, no, this is something which has been scientifically validated and things like that. So we had intense sessions. Finally, we ran into an article by a gentleman called Frank Miller. Now, this is a review article though, where he has taken 6 standard of cares and compared them with placebos, and 5 of them yielded no better or less than the placebo. But that happens to be a review article. You know, so in the hierarchy of evidence comes a little lower down. Honestly, I am really not convinced that you should have a placebo. I mean, they suggest that it has to go on only during the maintenance phase, not during the acute phase though. It will be useful if some of you really enlightened us on that.
The message I would like you to go home with perhaps is that there is no one right or wrong answer, and there is no way you can reach it. And as an ethics committee member, using these guidelines, and this is, I have given you a summary of what is written in Helsinki, read that, read the essays. See, ethics therefore becomes a very debatable issue. And it's very difficult to reach a judgment. It's a judgment that you're giving. So it has to be within reasonable grounds and based on this. And all you have, I keep, when I'm on an ethics committee, is I keep that patient as a center. How much is that one patient going to suffer? What are the precautions that the clinicians are taking? And are they convinced that this is essential to do? So we don't say yes to all placebo-controlled trials, and we don't say no to all placebo-controlled trials. I would suggest to you to keep an open mind and judge every protocol on its own merits and demerits using these guidelines. Let's move on to the second, even more controversial issue, and that is of post-trial access. And post-trial access, Helsinki tells us, to the best proven methods must be described in the study protocol. We need to look at this, and especially with drugs, new drugs, global clinical trials, the patients who are undergoing this study, will they ever afford it? Second, will the company come and market it in India? They can't market it because Indian costs are low. So, thank you.